This is the Ready for Takeoff podcast, episode 593. My name is George Nolly, and my guest today is Stephen Myers. And first of all, I want to wish all of you a happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, whatever you celebrate, and a Happy New Year to all of you. But right now, fasten your seatbelts and get ready for takeoff. So my guest today is Stephen Myers. He has a fascinating resume. He's an author, a successful four-time CEO and serial entrepreneur, the director of public and private company boards, a public speaker, and a two-time Air Force veteran and an accomplished aviator with 12 type ratings. He's a Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award recipient, and he was the first American since Charles Lindbergh to pilot an aircraft into Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. So I think we're going to really enjoy this conversation. Stephen, it is great having you with us today. Thank you for being here.
It's an honor to be with you, George. Really is.
Well, thank you. So tell us how you got your start in aviation.
Well, I was a sergeant in the Air Force in the 1960s, the mid 1960s, and my job was to be a computer repairman. So I was stationed at McCord Air Force Base working at NORAD headquarters. That's where NORAD headquarters was before Cheyenne Mountain was built. This was back in the mid 60s at McCord Air Force Base. You know, McCord was an interesting base because it was kind of a combination Air Defense Command, F-106 base, and Military Airlift Command MAC C-141 base. They were transporting troops back and from Fort Lewis next door over to Vietnam, and it was hosting NORAD headquarters. Well, there was a tech rep who I worked with, an IBM tech rep, who had interestingly had my job when he was in the Air Force and now was getting paid to do the same job as a civilian.
Paid a lot more. Paid a lot more.
Paid a lot more. And he wanted to be a commercial airline pilot. And so he was working on his commercial license on the GI Bill. And we had a flying club at McCord, and he was using that for training. And one day he invited me to go with him. Well, I was just riveted. He was explaining how everything worked to me. And somewhere along the line, he asked me if I wanted to try flying the airplane. So, you know, about 10 minutes later, after doing a bunch of steep turns and chandelles and lazy eights, he said, "Oh my God, I didn't know you knew how to fly. How long have you been flying?" And I said, "About 10 minutes. And he said, "What? You can fly this thing as well as I can." "Really?" I said. So he let me fly the plane back to the base. And I thought he was going to let me land the airplane, but he chickened out at the last minute. He wouldn't let me do it. But the thing was, I just had an instinct for it. I just loved it from the moment my hands felt the controls.
Wow. So now, did you sign up right away to take flying lessons?
Actually, I didn't. Shortly thereafter, I got transferred to Europe, and there was a European, much newer generation computer system in Europe that was doing much the same job that NORAD was doing in the United States. It was called the 412L system. So I got sent back to Keesler for a quick 90-day supervisor's course on this system and sent over there to mentor the techs there. They were having a really hard time maintaining the system over there. The techs I didn't think at the time the techs had been properly trained in troubleshooting. So I did that. Then my enlistment was up and I went back to Los Angeles and got a job with one of the local defense contractors and started going to night school. And the first course I took, of course, was a course in computer science. Why not start with something I knew something about?
Easy A, yeah.
Piece of candy, easy, piece of cake. So after the first evening, the professor's name was Mel Richens, and he asked me to stay after class. And when everybody had left, he said, "So what's the story with you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you can teach this course. You know as much about this as I do. What are you doing here?" And I told him about my background, and he said, "Okay, don't come here anymore. I'll give you an A. I don't want to see you at this. You're disrupting my class. You belong in something much more advanced. Oh, by the way, you have a day job, but what are you doing on Saturdays? How about coming to work for me? I have another business. You can write computer code for me. So I said, why not? So I went down there on Saturday to what I thought was going to be an office building, and it turned out to be an FBO at Van Nuys Airport. And turned out he was quite the entrepreneur. He owned an FBO and had a fleet of Cherokee aircraft out there on the ramp. He had a flight school. And he took one look in my eyes and he said, oh, I have you. I'm going to swap you flight training for code writing. So he had leased an IBM 360 and he needed somebody to write COBOL for him. And I knew Fortran and COBOL was very similar, was easy. So I started writing code for him every Saturday morning, and every Saturday afternoon, I had flying lessons. And that's how I got my private pilot's license.
Oh, that is so cool. You got it for free.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I was even making minimum wage. It's hard to know who got the better end of the deal, but it was great. So then I got into Stanford University and went there to study electrical engineering and computer science. But what happened was the dean of the School of Engineering sent me, every year they would send 2 students from Stanford School of Engineering to work at Jet Propulsion Laboratory as summer interns. And Caltech would send 2. So JPL had a deal with them that between the 2 schools, they'd send 4 interns. I was one of the interns that got sent. I spent 3 summers working at JPL, and you can't work at a JPL without falling in love with the space program. That's just going to happen. I worked on so many exciting things, Voyager program, Mariner, Venus, Mercury, a lot of interesting, deeply technical activities. And so I started shifting my interests and started taking aero and astro courses at Stanford. And who is my classmate? Sally Ride.
Oh,
So,
really?
so I decided, so when she wanted to be an astronaut, I decided I wanted to be an astronaut, you know, and so I thought the best way for me to make that happen was to go back into the Air Force and be a test pilot. So I started talking to the Air Force about OTS and at Medina, and then going to UPT, maybe at Willie. I had this all mapped out in my mind, and they were aching for me to go back in. So I maxed out on the Air Force officer qualification test, and it was like being a rock star. It was really impressive. So I had to switch my degree, though. You'll love this, from electrical engineering and computer sciences to mathematics in order to graduate in time to go back in the Air Force before I'd age out. So I think now the age limit's 35, but then it was like 26 and a half.
Right.
And so I squeezed in under the wire with a BS in mathematics and went to OTS. And I remember one of your podcast interviews was with a gentleman who had been a POW and come back. And I was at Randolph Air Force Base, my OTS class, when he came back from being a POW. They landed at Randolph in 73. I was there when he came in.
You're talking about Lee Ellis, obviously.
Yeah. So it was so heartwarming an experience, I can't tell you.
Sure.
So, I was all pumped up to go to UPT. I had at that point something like 250 hours of flight time. And that was more flight time than everyone else put together, so I thought it was all going to be great. And then the wheels came off. The Air Force didn't need pilots anymore. As a matter of fact, think about this. Maybe your listeners will remember what the macroeconomic environment of the 1970s was like. Remember the OPEC oil embargo? They started cutting back on flight hours because there wasn't fuel for the jets.
Right.
And they had all of these fabulous pilots, you included, coming back from Vietnam with chests full of medals and great combat experience. And they didn't need pilots anymore. And the pilot retention rate wasn't going to be a problem because the economy was sucking.
Right.
So they just maximally cut back on flight training. And they wanted me to go to Air Force Systems Command. The idea was, the program they have now where they have the 3-track system, that came out of that.
Uh-huh.
At the time, everybody would go through the T-37B and then the T-38.
T-38, right.
Now they don't waste T-38s on people that aren't going to go to, on the fighter track. So they wanted me to go to systems command because I had all this technical background. They were trying to find they wanted some guys to go be, backseaters. It was, so I didn't want to do that, of course. I was dead set on doing what I wanted to do. And I probably bent the wings in the process, but I basically said, look, I don't have a military obligation. I did 4 years enlisted and 2 years in the reserves. I'm here on contract. You either have to send me to UPT or you need to discharge me, right?
Uh-huh.
Me resign my commission. And I thought they'd roll over.
You got in a fight with a big guy and you thought he's going to back down.
That's it. That's exactly right. So I was devastated, that I just couldn't pull it off. George, everything happens for a reason, I believe. And
sure.
I'd have made a horrible astronaut. Now that I look at my aviation career and all of the wonderful opportunities I've had, I'm so grateful for it. Your listeners, haven't heard that part yet, but things worked out. Things work out. And, I had this ambition about being an astronaut, but I didn't really understand, or being a test pilot. I've been a terrible test pilot. That wasn't my strength. They're used to doing the same thing over and over and over again ad nauseum. Let's rehearse that mission 1,000 times. That's not my program. That's not where my strength is. My strength is in my ability to respond very quickly in an environment of uncertainty, which is why I'm a good entrepreneur.
Uh-huh.
And so it turns out that it was a blessing in disguise. But at the time, I remember how being brokenhearted I was that I wasn't getting. It was really the first time in my life where I had to face true disappointment. I wasn't going to get to do the thing that I really wanted to do. But I'm very resilient. And I was fortunate while I had been at Stanford, I had attracted the attention of companies that were interested in having me come work for them as an engineer after graduation. And so the first phone call I made, they just gave me the job over the phone. They wanted to know when I was going to show up and did they need to send me any money. So it wasn't hard for me to get a job with my background, even in a bad macroeconomic environment. So then for the next 7 years, I worked in aerospace in 10 different jobs. I started off as an engineer. And by the time, I started my first company, I was a vice president and had done a lot of things. I was very, very well prepared.
Now, did you buy an airplane during this process?
I continued to train. I didn't have the money to buy an airplane till I founded my first company, and which was a aerospace and defense technical consulting services business. We'll go into that in a minute. But I got my commercial license, my instrument rating, and my multi-engine rating. So it was maybe 1983 when I bought my first airplane alone. I had been in flying clubs. I had pieces of airplanes. I love flying bonanzas. That was a lot of fun. Things like that. I bought a 182 RG.
Uh-huh.
And then that lasted about a year. And then I got a 340, a Cessna 340.
Uh-huh.
That lasted 2 years. And then I got a 421. That was an airplane. I thought that the Cessna 421, it was the C model, was the best piston airplane ever made. And that lasted 3 years. And then I got an Aero Commander 690B prop jet. And that was a whole nother world of flying.
Uh-huh.
Because what would happen is I'd work hard, I'd train, learn all about how the airplane worked, go to school. I remember going to school on the 421C, Flight Safety Head of School.
Right.
And that was my first school, actually. And then I've been to 52 schools.
Really? 52
Yeah.
flight training schools.
Yeah. I have 12 jet type ratings, so that's 12 schools, but I had another, just for initials, but a lot of recurrent training. I've probably been in school every year, for at least 45 years that I started flying more advanced aircraft.
Tell
Yeah.
us about your first jet type rating.
So as my consulting business expanded, I was using my aircraft to get to the clients.
Uh-huh.
I realized, now this was the 1980s, now Reagan's president. It's morning in America, aerospace is booming. I've got clients all over the place. I'm hiring staff. I've got people. By the way, I went from one person to 800. And I ran that business for 25 years. After year 15, we went public. I was chairman and CEO for another 10 years. And during that entire 25 years, I was flying aircraft. So I went through, I'll have to start counting them up, all the airplanes I went through. But I needed more and bigger airplanes in order to meet my mission needs. I needed the lift. I had my Aero Commander for probably a decade. And early into that, maybe 2-3 years into having the Aero Commander, which was the aircraft I used to go to Russia, by the way.
Right.
I realized that for some of my missions, that wasn't the optimal aircraft. I really needed a jet. And I was based at Martin Aviation at John Wayne Airport. And there was a guy there who had a Citation 501. And he didn't know how to fly it. And he had a pilot who had been flying him around in some piston twin. They had bought it, and he didn't know how to fly it either. And so the idea was, I said, well, why, that plane's just sitting there while you guys figure out how to fly it. Why don't you just let me get some, build some time in that airplane? So I went to school and got typed as fast as I could make that happen. I went to Wichita, got typed in the Citation, and then came back and started flying that. And soon I realized that wasn't enough airplane. I was done with that. Then I got into a Citation S2. Maybe you know what that is. That's the 550. It's actually the precursor to the Citation 5. So they went from the Citation 2 to the Citation 5, but in the interim, they had a thing called an S2, which had the wet leading edge on the wings. With TKS, like in the Hawks, right? They didn't have boots. And that thing would carry 5,000 pounds of fuel and go basically about 400 knots. So I could fly that plane coast to coast nonstop. It was incredible. So that turned out to be a great airplane. Then a couple of years after that, I got a Hawker 800A. And I went to school on the Hawker, and I hired a guy who was an expert on Hawkers to crew with me, co-pilot me, mentor me. And I've discovered that that's the best way to do it. You've got to get somebody who really knows the airplane. When you get into mid-class or a large class cabin aircraft, you've got to have someone who's been there, done that to help you get up to speed. A lot of fun, huh? Yeah.
Very cool. Now, are you going to tell me that now you own a 737, like the one John Travolta shows on YouTube?
Sounds like a lot more fun than it really would be, because I keep thinking about all the maintenance, because
yeah,
my background's in, actually fixing things. And I think very judicious about maintenance. And I just thinking about all the things there are to go wrong with those airplanes. Can you imagine the crew he's got hanging around to get a flight off with that airplane? But I'm proud of him for his passion. I guess he got to fly crew for Qantas. Fabulous.
Right.
Yeah, great guy. The big deal for me was going to the Gulf Stream. So around 2001, I lucked out. One of my buddies who had more money than I'll ever have, he decided that he needed to have a Gulf Stream. And he asked me about, how should he go about that? And I said, well, I'll go get you a Gulf Stream if that's what you. And you just wire the money when I tell you to. And he said, you know more about it than I do, Steve. So, just go get me a plane. So I spent about 3 months working on it. Literally, it was that. About 3 months later, I call him on the phone and I said, look, I'm emailing you the wire instructions. Would you please wire, 20 some million dollars, whatever it was.
Uh-huh.
And he did. It just was as simple as that. And he didn't even ask me to tell him why, that was the plane, or he trusted me that much.
Wow.
So the deal was, though, I'd take 10% of the airplane. That was the deal. And I'd manage the airplane for him.
Uh-huh.
And that became the start of a charter business that I founded. So I had now several citations. I had Hawkers, an 800 XP at that point. I had several airplanes. And so with the Gulfstream, I could now offer full global charter capability, put that under the charter certificate. And I got to go to school and get type rated in the Gulfstream and started flying in short order Part 135 charters.
Uh-huh.
I didn't have to fly all the charters. I just cherry pick off the charters I wanted to fly. So the chief pilot, who had been the guy that initially trained me on Hawkers, he, fantastic guy, John Russin, he was the chief pilot. He would fly these Gulfstream charters. And when a really cool charter would come up, he'd say, Steve, do you want to fly the charter? So I'd get the flight. So we got to fly John Petty and the Heartbreakers out on tour.
Uh-huh.
I got to fly a lot of celebrities all over the world. In fact, I never actually met him. He was asleep in the back. But Tom Cruise and the Last Samurai crew, I flew them back from Japan. But I was the second leg. They'd flown from Japan to Anchorage, and I was there at 3:00 in the morning to fly the plane to New York. So I never got to actually meet Cruise.
And I assume that Last Samurai movie was before the Top Gun movies. So,
oh, yes.
So he wasn't yet interested in flying like he is now.
I don't know how far back that went, but, I see such tremendous passion that the man has for flying.
Right.
I love particularly him flying the P-51, and I've flown a P-51 and T-6 SNJ. I mean, those are wonderful experiences to have to fly those airplanes, but to get to have your own and around wherever he's got that with all it is just fabulous. So, but the Gulfstream was a very, very different kind of an animal than any other airplane. This is a G4.
Uh-huh.
For the first time, was flying an airplane. I was very good at it, but I had never flown an airplane that required so much detailed attention to so much. Was not the current model. Nowadays, we've got much better integrated avionics in these cockpits. The Boeing 777 was easier to fly than that G4 by a wide margin. It was a heavy workload airplane, and I remember going to flight safety for initial training on it. And the instructor walked into the room and he says, I want to congratulate you for now coming to the school that is the hardest school in the world for any airplane. This is it. It doesn't, everything, even the space shuttle is easier than this.
Wow.
So I thought that was really, really interesting. And they were right. It was such a mechanically intensive aircraft and just a lot of bells and whistles to master. It was hard work.
So really Steve, let me ask, what airplanes do you have currently? Do you still own airplanes?
I owned airplanes till last year. Here's what happened. My last airplane was a CJ2 that I've had for several years that I had heavily modified with Garmin avionics. The GTN 750 is just the cat's meow. And that's what the G3000 avionics system is built around, the GTN 750. It's basically the same concept. So I relocated from Los Angeles to Miami about a year ago, and I had planned to get a Phenom 300 type rating. And a buddy of mine has a Phenom 300 and said I could use it to train. I was going to go to school. And he said, well, you'll have more fun training in the airplane. And he had a guy. And by the way, it was easy for me to fly. Great airplane, very comfortable with it. But it's got the Garmin 1000 avionics in it. And I didn't like those. I just thought that was, after the 3000 avionics, nobody wants to go back and fly the 1000 avionics. So I kind of ended up passing on that deal. and have spent the bulk of the last year mastering boating. Got a big boat, working on my 100-ton license. And then while I wait, and then the macroeconomic environment turned against us, right? Where the prices are through the roof, the fuel's through the roof. And I've got a bunch of buddies that all want to have airplanes. And I'm going to put my goal for 2023 is my next jet. It's just, you have to be patient and get the timing right, get the right partners. It'll be a lot of fun.
So now tell us about how did it happen that you decided to fly to Russia, to the Kamchatka Peninsula? And do you speak Russian?
My Russian is so awful. I won't say anything beyond duh. Duh, not duh. So my first business, as I said earlier, was a aerospace and defense consulting practice. Now, you can go to my website, stephenmyers.com, to read about what that was all about, but it's a very complex story in of itself. But I provided very high value services in the aerospace industry. One of my vice presidents had a contract at JPL, same JPL we were talking about earlier, to assist with the joint Russian-American Mars program. So the Russians, whether you love them or hate them, are fanatics when it comes to space, and in particular Mars. Fascinated. And I've spent a lot of time in Russia. I've known many Russians, and they're just a very passionate people about certain things. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, their space program was in enormous jeopardy. They just didn't have the money. This vice president, who had been working for me, featured in the book. So I wrote a book about all of this called Crosswinds, Adventure and Entrepreneurship in the Russian Far East. Amazon bestseller, terrific book. And basically,
and there's a link, and Steve, let me interrupt you. There's a link to that in the show notes. I hope everybody goes to our show notes.
Yeah. And Tom Heinsheimer, Dr. Tom Heinsheimer, had been the guy shuttling between JPL and the Russian Institute of Science in Moscow, basically shepherding the joint Mars efforts that had been going on between the two countries. Well, turns out that the Russians' primary site for testing their rover, so in the joint program, the US was going to be responsible for the satellite, for the rocket, the probe, and the Russians were going to provide the rover. And there's a place on the Kamchatka Peninsula that looks like Mars. It's called the Plutoskaya volcano. It looks like Mars when you look at it. In the book, when you look at pictures, you'll think that you're looking at the Mars surface. And that's where they were doing their Mars rover testing. So he happened to be out there right after the fall of the Soviet Union with the gentleman who had been in charge of Russia's Soviet Union space program. They're in Kamchatka together. And, over too much vodka, they started having a conversation about, what could be done to save the now Russian space program. And Tom's view was, well, you need to make Russia safe for entrepreneurship. That's how you're going to save everything. If you want to save Russia, you need to get entrepreneurs to come to Russia. And then he started talking about me, for example, Steve, and he started talking about my background as an entrepreneur. And he said, yeah, Steve's prototypical of the kind of person that you'd need to come over here. And the gentleman said, well, fantastic. Let's invite him over. And Tom said, well, he's not coming over here. Why would he do that? He doesn't care about coming here. He's making plenty of dough. He's got a great business. He's got his airplanes. He's having a lot of fun. There's no way you're going to get him to come. And then he said, well, there must be something that Steve wants to come over here. We need him to come over here. What does he need? Well, you'll never agree. And they said, what is it? And he said, let him fly over here. Let him fly over one of his aircraft into the Kamchatka Peninsula. And he said, the way Tom tells it, the guy went white. And he said, "Do you have any idea what the last person to fly here got shot down? That was KAL 007."
Right. Yeah.
Right? And they didn't know, neither of them knew at the time that Lindbergh had even done it in 1931. Nobody knew this. I didn't know it. In
Uh-huh.
1992, we had no idea. We didn't think it had ever been done. So Tom comes back with this crazy story, and I'm going, "You're out of your mind. You have to." So it's such a great read, seeing how this developed.
Uh-huh.
How did you go from something you have to be out of your mind to even be thinking of doing something like that? It's super high risk, super dangerous. Don't have a GPS system in orbit. You're talking about horrible weather. You don't have any charts. You don't know what the landing facilities are going to be like, what the instrument approaches are going to be like. You know nothing. How are you going to even do that? Well, we went from that. Tom was a very persuasive guy, and I kind of fell in love with the exercise because I didn't think it would ever happen.
Uh-huh.
And that summer, that July of 92, we actually did it. We were able to, I put a crew together and a team, and we flew up to Alaska. And just getting to Nome was a lot of fun. That's exciting, in a twin engine prop jet in 1992. Very exciting. A lot of low level flying, a lot of practice flying 250, 500 feet off the deck. In fact, I flew the Iditarod Trail all the
Uh-huh.
way from Anchorage to Nome,
Uh-huh.
but it was in the summertime. And then over the Bering Straits into a place called Providencia, and eventually, long story, reaching Kamchatka and reaching Petropavlovsk. And it was like Lindbergh landing in Paris, is what it was like. I was not prepared, and nobody in the West knew about this. Nobody cared. But over there, I was the news for like 2 weeks in Far Eastern Russia.
Oh, that is so cool.
It was incredible. Incredible. I was a rock star. I was on TV every night
Uh-huh.
and ended up meeting the governor. And the governor and I ended up partnering on a Russian American joint venture and created a business in Far Eastern Russia, which converted the military air base at Petropavlovsk, Elizovo, into an international cargo aircraft refueling base. So we had contracts with all the cargo carriers and refueling wide body aircraft. What a incredible story of entrepreneurship that was. Incredible.
Wow. I can't wait to read the book Crosswinds. I can't wait to read that book. Um, this has been a fascinating story, Steve. Um, Tell us, as you've been very generous with your time. As we wrap up, what advice do you have for someone who's just starting out in aviation today?
You could pick a better time in the entire history of aviation to go into aviation than now. I'm so jealous of young people today with the opportunity in front of them. We're going to be, for the rest of our lifetime, George, we're going to be at least 100,000 pilots short.
Right. Uh-huh.
And what that means is a lot more demand than there is supply. There's stupid talk about reducing the number of pilots in the cockpit. That's not going to go anywhere. That's never
It better not.
that's, we're not even going to have pilots. We'll just fly them by remote control, right?
Right.
No,
Right.
this is nonsense. No, that's not going to work. So I think if you're a young person, you've got a lot more options today. They've raised the age for pilot training, and certainly in the Air Force, they've got different tracks now. So the washout rate is quite a bit low washout rate. If I had it to do over, maybe it would have worked for me if I'd have gone in the Navy. So, you've got, you can go to the Annapolis or go to the Air Force Academy. There's so many options. You can go to Embry-Riddle or one of those schools and get a solid foundation. That's the key. If you're going to be in aviation, it's your profession. You need to study hard, work hard, learn from the ground up. I'll tell you, I've been flying 53 years. I've never stopped learning. And that's the key. You have to be committed to continuous improvement, continuous training. It's the key to everything. I'm glad to see a lot more women going into aviation. I've met so many fabulous women aviators. There's a lot of women fighter pilots. You can go on YouTube channel and see all these gals doing a terrific job. Squadrons of gals flying F-15s. It's just a lot of fun. I think they have a wonderful future in front of them if they want to pursue it.
And you were talking about training. Can you share with us your most recent training to get qualified on the 777?
It was a dream of mine, talking about bucket list items. I didn't get to fly for the airlines. That wasn't, when I was younger, I fancied doing that. I thought that would be an awful lot of fun. But again, that's very regimented. I was flying charters. I had a lot of airline pilots come through and have great difficulty making the transition from flying for the airlines to flying charter, because the airline's so structured, it's so disciplined, and you get into the charter business, you're never going to fly the same thing twice.
Yeah.
You're going to have somebody come up to the cockpit in the middle of the flight telling you they don't want to go where you're going. They want you to go someplace else entirely. So everything in charter flying is improvised. So that requires a lot of skill, a lot of discipline. There's nobody to call who's going to handle everything for you, and you just fly the airplane. You've got to handle everything. You got to plan the fueling. You've got to do your own research on the weather. Every arrangement, if you're a pilot in command, you're responsible for everything. And so it's a very different mindset. What I see in the airlines is tremendous discipline in the cockpit, more than I see in charter. The reason is, and I talk about this in an article out for Airfax Journal about a year ago. It's called Flying with Malik. I'll make sure you have a link to that article. But it's very interesting what it's like, somebody who had a lot of experience flying charter going into an airline environment. And it turned out, no one knew at the time, but I was the oldest person to ever go through the 777 flight training program at United. And he was the youngest, the guy that was flying with me, Malik, Senegal. He was the youngest. So I wrote an article about what this was like, flying with somebody young enough to be my grandson, who turned out to be a better pilot than I was. And he was 24. And I was astounded at how good he was. It was really, really remarkable. I'm very proud of him. Joy to fly with him. So I wanted to fly the 777. I had this delusion that if I had the type rating, maybe I could get some of the cargo carriers to hire me, let me go out and fly some gigs. I'd fly for free. They don't even have to pay me. Just let me go out and fly the cargo gigs. I'll take the worst crap gig there is if I can go fly the 777. And I just had the best time in 777 training. It was hard. There were some aspects of the training I had to ask for extra time, because they assumed that I knew things about how airline operations worked that I didn't know. So I had to pick up a couple extra sim sessions in order to pick that up. I talk about that in the article. But what was important was I raised my hand and said, I got a problem. I don't know how to do that. I haven't been trained in that. I need to get training in that right now, rather than trying to fake it or just get through and get my type rating anyway. I've never been that kind of guy. I won't take a type ride until I feel like I'm ready. And it isn't about just getting your ticket punched. It's about really knowing what you're doing. And so the 777 was the penultimate for me. Same type rating as 787. It's just a joy. And I loved flying that airplane. And the best part was when I went to take my type rate at the end, the guy who was the line check airman for the 777 fleet for United was my co-pilot. And the check examiner for the fleet was my check airman. So these guys were the saltiest, crustiest guys you've ever seen in your life. It was just fabulous. So the oral, went on for 3 hours. And then, the ride went on so long, we had to have a restroom break. That was like 4 or 5 hours. It was heaven. It was just the finest sound I've ever heard in my life. Nice ride, Steve. Let's go to the gate. Taxi it into the gate.
Very cool.
It was a blast.
Steve, it has been great having you with us. Now, as we wrap up, what is on? I can't imagine what's on your aviation bucket list, but there must be something.
I've had so many bucket list items checked out. I'll tell you what I'd really love if I could make it happen. I don't know how to make it happen. Is I'd like to go to the space station. I'd like to go up on the SpaceX capsule up to the space station and spend a couple of weeks up there. I have no idea how to make that happen. But
wow, yeah, that's a tough one. Maybe one of our listeners, I've interviewed some astronauts. Maybe one of our listeners can come up with an idea on how you can do that.
well, it used to be you could pay to do it like $20 million or something, and the Russians would train you for a couple of years, and then you go up on the Soyuz up to the space station. But we're not doing that anymore with them. We have SpaceX handling it, so it's a much easier ride. It's a more automated process. It's all in English, so you don't have to speak Russian. I'm so grateful to you for having me on the show. I hope your listeners have enjoyed it.
Well, I'm sure they will. It's been wonderful having you with us. I want to thank you so much. Thanks again for listening. Subscribe now to the Ready for Takeoff podcast on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, and please rate us and post a review on the iTunes store. For show notes, resources, and more, head over to readyfortakeoffpodcast.com.